In the days following the 16th of February 1799, the citizens of Munich were in a celebratory mood. Their sovereign, the highly unpopular Charles Theodore, had passed away, marking the second time in just a bit over 20 years that Bavaria's ruling family had gone extinct. Although each time staying within the broader Wittelsbach dynasty, Bavaria was inherited by different branches of it, and this time it was Maximilian Joseph of the branch of Palatinate-Birkenfeld-Zweibrücken who took over. Whereas his predecessor had been hated for his attempts to sell out Bavaria, his wastefulness, and for his reactionary policies, Maximilian would vehemently defend his country's sovereignty and try to reform it into an efficient and liberal state. But upon coming to power, Bavaria was flooded with 110,000 Austrian soldiers, and about to be embroiled in the chaos of the Napoleonic Wars. In other words, the task ahead of him would not be an easy one. Maximilian was born in May of 1756 at Schwetzingen, a town located between Heidelberg and Mannheim. He was the second son of Frederick Michael, Count Palatine of Zweibrücken, a field marshal of the Holy Roman Empire who, among other things, had commanded the Reichsarmee in the 7 Years' War. After the death of Frederick in 1767, Maximilian was at first left without parental supervision, since his mother, Maria Franziska of Sulzbach, had been banished from her husband's court after giving birth to a son fathered by an actor. Maximilian was instead taken care of by his uncle, Duke Christian IV of Zweibrücken, who settled him in the Hôtel des Deux Ponts in Strasbourg. Christian took great care to give the boy a proper education, and his French tutors instilled in him the values of the Enlightenment. From 1770 he was nominally a colonel in the Royal Deux Ponts, a German regiment of the French army. In 1777 he actually took service and quickly rose to the rank of Major General. The previous year he had also become Count of Rappoltstein after the title had been given to him by his older brother. Maximilian, who spoke better French than German, spent his youth living the cheerful life of a gentleman in the Ancien Regime. He resided mostly in Strasbourg and his county of Rappoltstein, but also frequently stayed in Landau and Paris. For a time, he accommodated Clemens von Metternich, the future Austrian Chancellor, at his home in Strasbourg. In 1785 he was married to Princess Augusta Wilhelmine of Hesse-Darmstadt, and a year later their first son, Ludwig, was born. The young couple were fairly close to the French royal family and named their son after Louis XVI, who also became his godfather. On their many trips to Paris, Princess Augusta had become acquainted with Marie Antoinette, and she maintained an ongoing correspondence with her. Their carefree lives would ultimately be upset by the French Revolution. Forced to flee the country, the family left first for Darmstadt, the home of Augusta, and then for Mannheim, where they lived under very modest circumstances. Maximilian and his older brother were denied exile in Bavaria because they resisted Charles Theodore's plans to exchange lands with Austria, thereby ruining their relationship. When riots broke out in Mannheim, they fled once again and would later stay at Schwetzingen, Ansbach, as well as ROHRBACH Castle. It was here in 1796 that Augusta Wilhelmine died of tuberculosis. She was only 30 years old and left behind 4 children. A year later, Maximilian married Princess Caroline of Baden. Back in 1795, he lost another close family member, his older brother, Charles August. After the unexpected death, Maximilian succeeded him as Duke of Zweibrücken, a title that he in turn had inherited from their uncle, Christian. By this time, however, the territory was already entirely under French occupation. Since his brother had also been heir to Charles Theodore of Bavaria, this position was carried on to Maximilian as well. Even so, it wasn't completely clear that he would actually succeed him. When Charles Theodore passed away from a stroke in 1799, almost 110,000 Austrian troops were stationed in his lands, and the Bavarian army, numbering only about 17,000 men, had been integrated into the Austrian units. To annex Bavaria at this point would have been both tempting and easy for the Austrians, who had tried to gain control of it several times in the preceding decades. But the opposition of Prussia and Russia and the uncertainty of the upcoming War of the Second Coalition made them stand back and allow Maximilian to come to power. Having thus gained the titles of Elector of Bavaria, Count Palatine of the Rhine, as well as Duke of Jülich and Bag, he was now ruler of the third largest state in the Holy Roman Empire and became known as Maximilian IV Joseph. Upon coming to power, his first priority was the reconstruction of Bavaria's army, which had fallen into a sorry state. Hardly any of the units were at full strength, the uniforms were unpopular and impractical, and the troops were poorly trained. Under his capable generals, however, the army was reformed along French models and soon became the most modern armed force in Germany. Large changes were also about to take place in the Bavarian state apparatus and in its foreign policy. In these matters, Maximilian was guided by his closest advisor, the Count of Montgelas. Having originally entered service in the Bavarian government in 1779, Montgelas had fallen out of favor with Charles Theodore for his deeply anti-clerical views and for his membership in the Illuminati. Heading to Zweibrücken, he instead began working for Duke Charles August and later became the private secretary of Maximilian Joseph. When, in 1799, he came to power in Bavaria, Montgelas was appointed Minister of the Royal House and of Foreign Affairs. In the years to come, the two would lead a revolutionary program of reform which in many ways laid the foundation for the modern Bavarian state. As early as 1802, the secularization of Bavaria began to be carried out in earnest. Numerous monasteries were closed, their assets nationalized, and the buildings either demolished or given a new purpose. Compulsory education, which had technically been introduced already by Maximilian III, was for the first time enforced that same year. Measurements were standardized, internal tariffs abolished, and the power of the guilds was weakened. In 1805, all hereditary and purchasable offices were done away with, and 3 years later, Bavaria gained its first constitution. It, among other things, granted all citizens equality before the law, ensured some, although not complete, freedom of the press, and abolished serfdom and the nobility's exemption from taxes. In 1813, torture was also abolished, and the Jews living in Bavaria were granted greater freedom. In addition to all of this, the administration was overhauled and made more efficient. His change in foreign policy would be equally as radical. Although Maximilian would have preferred to have stayed neutral, he was initially forced through Austrian pressure to join the Second Coalition against France. The loss of the Battle of Hohenlinden in 1800 and the subsequent Treaty of Lunéville in 1801 led Maximilian to forfeit his territories on the left bank of the River Rhine, in other words the Duchy of Jülich and parts of the Palatinate. Then in 1803, the remainder of his Palatine lands were transferred to Baden as part of the Imperial Recess, a grand reorganization of the states in the Holy Roman Empire. He was, however, compensated for these losses with new territories closer to home. After 3 peaceful years, the next European war loomed in 1804. As a new anti-French coalition was taking shape, however, Maximilian was gravitating towards Napoleon. Since both the French and Austrians strictly refused to accept Bavarian neutrality, he was forced to pick sides. On the one hand, he distrusted the Austrian Habsburgs, who had always been a threat to Bavaria, and on the other, France offered to greatly expand Bavaria's territory and to bestow the title of King to Maximilian. Although there were concerns about the durability of Napoleon's success, a secret alliance agreement was eventually signed between the two in August of 1805. It wouldn't be long before the deal paid off. In September, the Austrians initiated the War of the Third Coalition by invading Bavaria with an army of about 70,000 men. But Napoleon and his Grand Armée surrounded them at Ulm, thereby forcing a surrender. He then went on to capture Vienna and defeated the numerically superior Russo-Austrian force at the Battle of Austerlitz. Finally, the Treaty of Pressburg, signed on the 26th of December 1805, took Austria out of the conflict. Having provided some 30,000 Bavarian troops and stood by the alliance even as his country was invaded, it was now time for Maximilian to be rewarded. For his loyalty to Napoleon, the electorate of Bavaria was upgraded to the rank of kingdom, and on the 1st of January 1806, Max Joseph was proclaimed King Maximilian I Joseph. This was followed in June by Bavaria's formal exit from the Holy Roman Empire and entry into the newly created Confederation of the Rhine. According to the Treaty of Pressburg, Maximilian's lands were also greatly extended southwards, receiving the formerly Austrian territories of Tyrol and Vorarlberg. In exchange for this, Bavaria renounced Würzburg, which had only been won in 1803. Finally, the Franco-Bavarian alliance was cemented by the marriage of Maximilian's daughter Augusta to Eugène de Beauharnais, the stepson and soon-to-be adopted son of Napoleon. Having no interest in the growing sentiment of German nationalism, Maximilian and Montgelas's foreign policy was shaped purely by Bavarian interests. This pragmatism led them for many years to become the most faithful of Napoleon's German allies. Over the course of this time, Bavaria saw a number of territorial changes, generally leading towards more coherent borders. By 1810, it had lost South Tyrol and the old Duchy of Berg, but had among other lands gained Salzburg from Austria in the east, as well as Bayreuth and Ansbach in the northwest. The relationship with France would eventually turn sour, however, partially because of economic and military exploitation. A major turning point was Napoleon's disastrous campaign into Russia in 1812. With 30,000 men, nearly its entire army having been wiped out, Bavaria now began to detach itself from the retreating Napoleon. This move was passionately backed both by Bavaria's most distinguished military leader, Field Marshal Karl Philipp von Wrede, and by the Crown Prince Ludwig. On the 8th of October 1813, Maximilian finally agreed to join the Sixth Coalition, ending his cooperation with France. 8 days later, Napoleon was defeated at the Battle of Leipzig. The Bavaria that emerged after the Napoleonic Wars bears close resemblance to its modern borders. Maximilian's price for joining the coalition had been a guarantee of his kingdom's continued independence, but its borders would nonetheless be radically changed in the years to come. Through the Congress of Vienna in 1814 and later the Treaty of Munich in 1816, the whole country was pushed westwards. The territories that had been gained from Austria were returned, for which Bavaria was compensated with new lands in Franconia and Swabia. It also gained an exclave on the left bank of the river Rhine, made up of parts of the old electoral Palatinate and other lands. The Congress of Vienna also created the German Confederation, a replacement for the Holy Roman Empire which had been dissolved in 1806. Seeking to protect Bavaria's independence, Maximilian insisted on the principle of full sovereignty being left to the German reigning princess, and was thereby largely responsible for its weak organization. Consequently, when in 1818 he granted a new liberal constitution to his people, it was partially to secure popular support for this policy. His minister, the Count of Montgelas, had opposed this concession. The fairly powerless parliament introduced in the 1808 constitution had barely ever convened and had left Montgelas as a kind of dictator. In 1817, however, the opposition, spearheaded by Prince Ludwig, finally overthrew him, making the new constitution possible. As another consequence of his fall, the late minister's ecclesiastical policy was reversed and the power of the clergy was restored. The new parliament proved to be more independent than Maximilian had anticipated, and already in 1819 he considered dissolving it. But this never happened, and his genuine popular sympathies also prevented him from strictly enforcing the Karlsbad decrees. These were a number of repressive policies introduced in the German Confederation that aimed to quell growing liberal sentiment, and they did lead to arrests of Bavarian citizens. But Maximilian had a tendency to examine these cases himself, leading many suspects to be freed of charges. In general, he was a very popular king and close to his citizens. Maximilian personally talked to people from all levels of Bavarian society, discussing their problems and needs. He would almost daily walk around unaccompanied on the streets of Munich and engage in casual conversations with passers-by. Back in 1801, he also led a rescue operation when a glassmaker's workshop had collapsed. This ended up saving the life of a 14-year-old orphaned apprentice called Joseph von Fraunhofer. Following the incident, Max Joseph donated books to the boy and forced the glassmaker to allow him time to study. Eventually, he went on to become one of the most famous optical scientists and artisans in history, inventing the spectroscope and spectroscopy and making Bavaria noted for fine optics. Before his death in 1826, Fraunhofer was knighted by the king. Tangible signs of Maximilian's reign can be seen today in many parts of Munich. For example, the first systematic expansion of the city took place during his time in power, with the Briennerstrasse at its core. In 1810, he ordered the construction of the neoclassical National Theatre. Having been built because the nearby Cuvelier Theatre had too little space, it stood finished 8 years later. Facing the structure is the Max Joseph Platz, a square named after the king, and at its center stands a monument to him, completed a decade after his death. Maximilian also had built the Royal Riding School, designed by the famous architect Leo von Klenze, as well as the castle of Getterberg, which he gave to one of his sons. It is also noteworthy that he moved the Bavarian State University from Ingolstadt, where it had been located for centuries, to the town of Landshut. In the summer of 1825, Maximilian's physical strength waned. Having spent an evening as a guest in the Palais Vorontsov in Munich, he was found dead in his bedroom in Nymphenburg Palace the next morning. The day was October 13th, 1825. He was outlived by 9 children, 4 of whom he had had with his first wife, Augusta Wilhelmine, and 5 of which were by his second marriage to Caroline of Baden. Maximilian was succeeded by Crown Prince Ludwig.